There are places in the American West where the land itself seems to swallow secrets. Wide stretches of nothing, dry grass stretching out to the horizon. Towns so small they don't even get their own weather report. And in those places, when something goes wrong, really wrong, it could take a very long time for anyone to notice. This is one of those stories. It starts in the summer of 2019 in a place called Harlan's Crossing. It's not a town exactly. It's more of a collection of ranches and a single gas station that also sells bait and lottery tickets. It sits about 40 miles outside of a mid-sized city in Central Oregon, and the closest sheriff's substation is 22 miles away. The kind of place where people move there because they don't want to be found. And that's exactly why Carl Maddox chose it. Carl was 46 years old, lean, quiet, the kind of man who could stand in a room for 10 minutes and nobody would remember he was there. He'd moved to Harlan's Crossing in 2015, bought a 40-acre ranch with a modest farmhouse, a barn, and about 600 feet of fencing that was already falling apart when he moved in. He didn't fix most of it. He didn't seem to fix much of anything. The ranch sat there, dry and dusty, and Carl sat with it. His neighbors knew him as polite. Distant but polite. He waved when he drove past. He showed up to the rare community gathering and stood near the back with a beer he barely touched. Nobody knew much about him before Harlan's Crossing. He didn't offer, and nobody really asked. That was the unspoken agreement out there. You don't dig into other people's business, and they don't dig into yours. Carl had one visitor who came regularly, a woman named Diane Voss. Diane was 38. She lived in the city, worked as a dental hygienist, and had 2 kids from a previous marriage, a boy of 12 and a girl of 9. She and Carl had been together for about 2 years by the summer of 2019. She'd drive out to the ranch on weekends sometimes, or on her days off. The neighbors who noticed her said she seemed happy, relaxed even, like the ranch was a place she could breathe. On July 14th, 2019, Diane drove out to the ranch for the weekend. She never came back. Now, here's the thing that made this case so strange from the very beginning. Diane Voss was not immediately reported missing. Not because nobody cared, but because Carl called it in himself. He drove into the nearest town on Sunday morning, July 15th, and used the phone at the gas station. The cell service out there is basically non-existent, and told the person who answered at the sheriff department that his girlfriend had left the night before. Said she'd gotten into a fight with him about something small, something stupid, and she'd packed a bag and driven off in the middle of the night. He said he assumed she'd gone back to the city and would probably turn up when she was ready. The deputy who took the report noted it down. Asked a few questions. Carl answered them calmly. Gave Diane's full name, her home address in the city, her car make and model. Everything they needed. He didn't seem upset, exactly. He seemed tired, a little embarrassed. Maybe the way someone might be if their girlfriend had just stormed off after a fight. The deputy said they'd look into it. Carl nodded and went back to his ranch. For the next 3 days, nothing happened. The sheriff's office made a few calls. Diane's apartment in the city. She lived alone. The kids were with their father that week. Showed no sign she'd come back. Her car, a 2016 Honda Civic, was not parked outside. Her phone was going straight to voicemail. But none of this was flagged as urgent right away. People disappear all the time. Women leave bad relationships. They show up at their mother's house or a friend's place, or they just need a few days. The system, such as it is, assumed that's what happened here. It wasn't until July 19th, 5 days after Diane had driven out to that ranch, that her ex-husband called the police. He'd been expecting the kids back, and Diane hadn't shown up to pick them up, hadn't called, hadn't texted. And that, her ex-husband said, was not like her. Not at all. That's when things started to move. Within 48 hours, a missing persons case was opened. Diane's apartment was searched. Her bank records were pulled. Her phone records, what little could be recovered, showed the last signal it had pinged off a cell tower about 12 miles from Carl Maddox's ranch at 9:47 p.m. on July 14th. After that, nothing. Nobody found the car. And that was the first real knot in this story. Diane had driven out to the ranch. That much was confirmed. She'd filled up her gas tank at a station about 30 miles away, paid with her debit card at 4:22 in the afternoon. She bought a bottle of wine. She was in a good mood, according to the clerk who remembered her. She was going to see her boyfriend for the weekend. Everything about that afternoon was completely normal. But at some point that night, Diane Voss and her Honda Civic both vanished. Carl Maddox was interviewed again, multiple times, and every single time he told the same story. She'd left in the middle of the night after a fight. He hadn't heard her go. He'd been asleep. He didn't know where she went, and he hadn't tried to stop her. He was calm, cooperative, answered every question directly. Detectives noted that he showed no signs of deception, no fidgeting, no inconsistencies, no emotional outbursts. He was, by all accounts, the perfect witness. And that's what made them uneasy, because there was something else happening at Carl Maddox's ranch in July of 2019, something that had nothing to do with Diane Voss, or so it seemed at first. The fires. Central Oregon had been dealing with a brutal stretch of dry heat that summer. Wildfires were breaking out across the region. Small ones mostly. Brush fires along the edges of highways. Fires eating through scrubland and dry grass. The air quality had been bad for weeks. Everyone in the area was on edge about it. And then, on July 22nd, 8 days after Diane disappeared, a fire broke out on Carl Maddox's property. It started sometime in the early hours of the morning. By the time anyone noticed, it had already consumed most of the barn and a stretch of dry pasture behind it. The fire department out of the nearest town responded, and it took them the better part of a day to get it under control. It was a bad fire, the kind that sounds impressive when you describe it. Flames 50 feet high, smoke visible for miles away, the whole thing. And it destroyed a significant portion of Carl's ranch. The fire was ruled accidental. Electrical fault in the barn, most likely. The heat had been extraordinary. It wasn't unusual for fires like this to start on their own during a stretch like that. Carl seemed shaken by it, but not devastated. He'd filed an insurance claim within a week. At first, nobody connected the fire to Diane Voss. Why would they? The timing was a coincidence. The fire was on Carl's property, yes, but it was on a different part of the property from the house, and it had been ruled accidental by the fire investigator. The missing persons case was being handled by a different set of people entirely. But one person did make the connection, a woman named Sandra Herrera. Sandra was a reporter for a small regional paper, the kind of paper that covers city council meetings and high school football scores. She was in her mid-40s, sharp, dogged, the kind of journalist who couldn't let a loose thread hang. She'd been following the Diane Voss case because it was the most interesting thing that had happened in Harlan's Crossing in years. And when the fire broke out on Carl's ranch a week after Diane disappeared, Sandra started asking questions. Not to the sheriff. Not to Carl. She started asking the people who lived nearby. And here's where the story gets interesting. Because it turns out that the neighbors of Carl Maddox had noticed a few things over the years that they hadn't mentioned to anyone. Because in Harlan's Crossing, you don't mention things. You don't interfere. You let people live. One neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Harold Briggs, lived about a mile down the road from Carl's place. Harold told Sandra that he'd seen smoke coming from Carl's property before. Not a big fire. Small fires. Controlled burns, he assumed. A lot of ranchers did that, burned off dead brush to clear the land. But Harold said the fires on Carl's property didn't look like controlled burns. They burned at odd times. Late at night. In the rain, once, which didn't make sense for a controlled burn. And they always seemed to be concentrated in the same area, behind the barn, in a stretch of land that Harold couldn't see clearly from his property. Another neighbor, a woman named Patrice Dunn, told Sandra something different. She said that about a year before Diane disappeared, she'd seen Carl dragging something heavy across his property in the dark. She couldn't make out what it was. It was late, and she was looking out her bedroom window. She'd thought it was an irrigation pipe or something like that, and she'd thought nothing more of it. But when Sandra came asking questions, after Diane was already gone, Patrice remembered it, and it bothered her. Sandra wrote about all of this, not as accusations, as observations, things that might or might not mean something. The article ran in her paper and got picked up by a couple of larger outlets. And that's when the sheriff's department started paying closer attention to Carl Maddox. They got a search warrant for his property. They searched the house first. Found nothing unusual. A neat, sparse place. A few books. Some clothes. A kitchen that looked like it was barely used. No signs of struggle. No signs of blood. Nothing that jumped out as evidence of anything. Then they searched the barn. What was left of it, anyway? Mostly ash and charred timber. The fire investigator went back in, this time with a different set of questions. And he found something. Buried in the ash, in a section of the barn floor that had burned hottest, he found fragments of bone. Small fragments, partially destroyed by the heat. Enough to be significant, but not enough to be conclusive on their own. The state forensics lab took months to work with what they had. But from the beginning, the investigators suspected those bones belonged to Diane Voss. Carl Maddox was arrested on September 3, 2019. He was charged with murder in the first degree. And here is where Carl's composure, his stillness, the way he'd held himself through months of questioning, finally started to crack. Not visibly, not dramatically, but in the way he handled his defense. He hired a lawyer, a good one, a criminal defense attorney from the city who specialized in exactly this kind of case. And the defense strategy was elegant in its simplicity. There was no body. Not really. Fragments of bone that might belong to Diane Voss, but might not. No murder weapon. No confession. No eyewitness. No direct evidence that Carl had done anything other than live on a ranch where a fire accidentally destroyed a barn. The prosecution had a timeline. They had Carl's calm, measured account of events. They had the suspicious fires that Harold Briggs had seen over the years. They had Patrice Dunn's observation of Carl dragging something in the dark. They had the fact that Diane's car had never been found. And they had the bone fragments. But they needed more. The trial began in January of 2020. It was held in the county courthouse, and it drew a small but intense crowd, the kind of trial that people in the area felt deeply about, even if they couldn't quite explain why. Carl sat at the defense table in a clean shirt and a dark jacket, and he looked, by all accounts, like a man who had done nothing wrong. The prosecution spent 2 weeks building their case. They laid out the timeline piece by piece. Diane's drive out to the ranch. The last cell phone ping. Carl's calm, consistent story about her leaving in the middle of the night. The lack of any evidence that she had actually gone back to the city. The absence of her car. The small, strange fires on his property. The bone fragments in the ash. And then they called a witness that nobody expected. A man named Gerald Toole. Gerald was a construction worker who'd done some odd jobs for Carl over the years. Minor repairs, fence work, that sort of thing. He'd been paid in cash, always. He was a quiet man, lived alone, kept to himself. Nobody had thought to talk to him until a detective, going through Carl's financial records, noticed a pattern of small cash withdrawals that lined up with dates when Gerald had been seen at the ranch. Gerald took the stand and told the jury something that changed the entire shape of the case. He said that about 6 months before Diane disappeared, Carl had asked him a question. An odd question, the kind that sticks in your memory, even if you don't know why at the time. Carl had asked Gerald how hot a fire needed to burn to destroy bone. Gerald said he'd laughed at first. Asked Carl why he wanted to know. Carl had said he was curious. Said he'd seen something on television. Gerald hadn't thought much of it. He'd given Carl a rough answer. Something he remembered from a job years earlier where they'd had to deal with cremation residue on a construction site. He said the temperature needed to be very high, sustained, and that even then, it wasn't always complete. Carl had nodded, thanked him, and changed the subject. Gerald said he hadn't remembered that conversation until a detective came to his door and asked him about it specifically. And even then, he said, he'd almost not mentioned it. It had seemed so small at the time. It didn't seem small anymore. The defense argued that Gerald was an unreliable witness, that the conversation could have been about anything, a campfire, a curiosity, nothing sinister. And maybe that was true, but the jury heard it, and they held it. The trial went on for another week. More evidence was presented. Expert testimony about the burn patterns on Carl's property. Analysis of the bone fragments, which were, by this point, confirmed with reasonable confidence to be human and consistent in size and density with a woman of Diane Voss's approximate build. Still not conclusive. Still not a body. Carl Maddox took the stand himself, which surprised almost everyone. He sat there in that same clean, quiet way he did everything. And he told his story again. The same story he'd been telling since July. Diane had come to the ranch on July 14th. They'd had dinner. They'd talked. Late in the evening, they'd had an argument. He wouldn't say what it was about, and his lawyer didn't press him, and Diane had gotten upset and decided to leave. He'd gone to bed. He hadn't heard her go. He didn't know where she was. The prosecutor cross-examined him for hours, pressed him on every detail, every small inconsistency, every gap, and Carl held. He sat there, and he held, the way a stone holds in a river. Steady, immovable, patient. But there was one moment, one small, almost imperceptible moment, that several people in that courtroom remembered afterward. The prosecutor asked Carl about the fire, about the barn, about the morning he'd called it in. And Carl answered normally, calmly, the way he'd answered everything. But when the prosecutor asked him whether he'd been surprised by the fire, whether it had caught him off guard, Carl paused, just for a beat, a fraction of a second longer than any of his other answers. And then he said, "No, I wasn't surprised." He caught himself almost immediately, corrected himself, said what he meant was that he'd expected fires during the heat, that it wasn't unusual for the area. The jury might not have noticed the slip. Some of them probably didn't. But the prosecutor noticed. And Sandra Herrera, sitting in the back of the courtroom, noticed. And a few of the jurors, later, would say that moment had stayed with them. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On the fourth morning, they came back with a verdict. Guilty of murder in the first degree. Carl Maddox was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was 50 years old when they let him out of that courtroom. He didn't say anything, didn't react in any visible way. He just walked, the way he always walked, quiet and steady, and the door closed behind him. Now, here's what the trial did not answer, and what, to this day, remains unanswered. Diane Voss's car was never found. It was not in any body of water within 100 miles. It was not in any junkyard or salvage lot. It was not reported at any border crossing or in any other state. It simply disappeared the way Diane did, without a trace. The bone fragments in the barn were the closest thing to a body that the prosecution ever produced. They were never able to recover enough to make a full identification through DNA. The confirmation that they were human and consistent with a woman of Diane's build was as far as the science could go. Carl Maddox never confessed. Not during the investigation. Not during the trial. Not in the years since. He sits in a state prison in Oregon, and he has given no interviews, made no statements, offered no explanation for what happened on that ranch in July of 2019. And Diane's disappearance, the full story of it, the real story of what happened that night, died with his silence. But there's one more thing, one last piece of this that doesn't quite fit, and that's Sandra Herrera, who continued covering the case long after the trial ended, eventually uncovered. When Sandra went back through Carl's records, not for the trial, but for a long-form article she was writing 2 years later, she found something in his financial history that the prosecution had either missed or deemed irrelevant. In the months before he moved to Harlan's Crossing in 2015, Carl had been living in Washington State. And in Washington, there was another woman, a woman named Lena Cartwright. Lena had been Carl's girlfriend for about a year. And in March of 2015, Lena had reported Carl to the police for a series of strange behaviors, disappearances, odd requests, a controlling streak that had escalated over time. She'd been scared of him, she said, genuinely scared. 2 weeks after Lena filed that report, Carl moved to Oregon. The case in Washington was never pursued. Lena Cartwright is alive. She lives somewhere on the East Coast now, and she has not spoken publicly about Carl Maddox. But when Sandra reached out to her, just once by phone, Lena said one thing before she hung up. She said, "I'm glad I left when I did." And she said it in a way that suggested she understood, maybe better than anyone, exactly what Carl Maddox was capable of. Diane Voss was not that lucky. She drove out to a ranch on a dry July afternoon with a bottle of wine and a weekend ahead of her, and she never drove back. Somewhere on that 40 acres of nothing, in the dust and the heat and the silence, the story of what happened to her ended. And Carl Maddox, who sat through months of questions and a weeks-long trial without ever once breaking, took that story with him. Some secrets are buried deep enough that no fire can reach them. And some of them, even when the fire burns everything else to the ground, managed to survive. Diane Voss deserved better than that ranch. She deserved better than silence. And somewhere in a courtroom record in a small-town newspaper and the memories of the people who knew her, the shape of her life and the shape of her ending exist side by side. One bright and ordinary and real, and the other dark and incomplete and still, after all these years, not fully understood. That's the thing about places like Harlan's Crossing. The land doesn't give up what it takes. Not willingly. Not ever. And sometimes, the truth is the thing that burns slowest of all.